Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jessica Rockhold, and I'm the Executive Director of the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education. And it's really a privilege to welcome you today to the Auschwitz Speaker Series. We're so grateful that you're spending part of your afternoon with us. Just a quick note about the format we're using. This is a Zoom webinar. You're going to be able to ask questions of our presenter through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So as she speaks, please feel free to submit your questions, and we'll be joined at the end by MCHE's historian, Dr. Shelley Klein, who will then moderate those questions to our presenter. On behalf of Union Station, Kansas City and MCHE, it's such a privilege to be able to bring this speaker series to our community. It is offered in support of the exhibition Auschwitz, Not Long Ago, Not Far Away, currently on display at Union Station, Kansas City, and recently extended until March 20th. So if you have not had a chance yet to see the exhibition, I cannot encourage you more. Just please go see this exhibition. When we partnered with Union Station and we began to discuss how to support this exhibition in a broader way, how could we provide educational opportunities for students, for teachers, for our general community, we knew that we wanted to offer this speaker series. And because of the circumstances of 2020 and the benefit that we gained from Zoom, we knew that we were going to have access to international presenters. And it immediately came to our mind that we wanted to invite today's presenter. We knew that we wanted to present Holocaust history, but also Holocaust history that's being very proactively worked on in an interesting way. And that's what Professor Sturdy-Calls does. So today it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Caroline Sturdy-Calls. She is a professor of conflict archaeology and genocide investigation at Staffordshire University, and she specializes in Holocaust studies. She was the 2016 Fred and Maria da Vinci Memorial Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. For those of you who have Kansas City connections, you will recognize the da Vinci name. Maria and Fred were two of our local survivors. And so it's wonderful that Caroline has that connection to our local family. And she is the author of multiple pieces, but I'm going to highlight her book, Finding Treblinka, Archaeological Investigations at Treblinka Extermination and Labor Camps. So with that, I'd like to invite Caroline to come on and share her archaeological information with us.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and thank you to the Midwest Center for Holocaust Education and Union Station in Kansas City, and particularly to you, Jessica, and to Shelley as well for the invitation to speak to you once again, following on from my presentation in 2017 when I was able to come and meet you there in person. So it's a pleasure to speak to you again. I'm going to share my screen with you now so that you can see some of the images of some of the work that I've been doing at the two camps at which I'm going to discuss with you today. So in my presentation, I'm going to discuss with you two infamous Holocaust landscapes. Treblinka, which is best known as the site where 800,000 to 1 million people were murdered at the extermination camp between the 23rd of July 1942 and the autumn of 1943, most of whom were Jews. And secondly, the camp complex at Bergen Belsen, which was embedded in public consciousness when the disease-ridden concentration camp was liberated by the British forces in April 1945. And they discovered an ultimate death toll of around 53,000 people, around 14,000 of those who unfortunately perished after liberation when they failed to recover from the medical conditions acquired whilst incarcerated. And in my paper, I'd like to discuss a range of material traces derived from the genocidal actions at both of these sites and illustrate how forensic archaeological approaches have been utilized to locate and also to record surviving evidence. I'll reflect really on a decade of research, so unfortunately I'm not going to be able to share all of the findings with you today, but happy to answer any questions about anything that I speak about and anything I don't have time to speak about at the end. But I'd really like to reflect on how the material and forensic turns in Holocaust studies have facilitated new understandings of Holocaust landscapes, and particularly the experiences of those who encountered them, whilst also providing new opportunities for commemoration and education internationally. Before we take a look at the historical background, to these sites and also the details of the forensic archaeological works, I wanted to highlight several important issues connected to both camps that affected my methodological approach. Now, obviously, it's important to point out that these two camps are incredibly different for the reasons I'll share with you shortly in the way that they operated, but they share several things in common in terms of the way that they were treated in the aftermath of genocide. First of all, both of these camps have well-established historical narratives associated with them. And those historical narratives have been derived from many decades of historical research that's predominantly hinged on the collection of testimonies of survivors, of the study of traditional historical sources, documents, photographs, and the like. And the narratives that have been built up over the years suggest for both of these sites that the physical traces of both the victims and the Nazis' crimes were destroyed. At both camps, cremation was used as a form of disposing of the bodies of the victims at various times throughout the camp's periods of operation. And therefore, the literature often suggests that in both of these places, the bodies of the victims were therefore entirely destroyed. And both camps, you'll note from the images shown on the screen here, have no actual original standing remains that are easily visible to visitors when they're walking around the site. And again, this is for two different reasons, but the end product, as I'll come to shortly, is the same. So at Treblinka, this is because the extermination camp was levelled by the Nazis when its operations were shut down in the summer and autumn of 1943. So the buildings were blown up, the buildings were demolished, and the ground was ploughed to make the site look like a farm. At Bergen Belsen, the site itself actually survived intact when the British liberated in 1945. However, they deemed it necessary to burn the site to the ground in an attempt to control the disease that was present there. Whilst at Treblinka, the failure of Soviet and Polish investigators to locate the traces of the gas chambers and mass graves were seen as proof that no physical evidence survived at Treblinka. As I mentioned, irrefutable proof of atrocities were evident at Bergen Belsen when the British Army arrived. And so we have two similar but different situations here, in that in essence, people think that Treblinka was entirely destroyed by the Nazis. At Bergen Belsen, the historical narrative seems to suggest that everything we know about the site, we know because it was well documented when the British liberators came there and saw those standing buildings. And as I'll show shortly, in the course of the forensic archaeological works that I did, it was demonstrated that neither of those common narratives appear to be true. And so there were both Treblinka and Bergen Belsen didn't see permanent memorials constructed at the sites until the early 1960s. So both of them were left as they lay. Both of them were undoubtedly subjected to looting activity, and then memorials were constructed that irreversibly changed the landscape in the 1960s. And both are now defined by peaceful green landscapes, which, as I say, are almost entirely devoid of any obvious traces of the crimes that were perpetrated there. The second issue about the narratives at both of these sites is that they centre on specific periods of both of these camps' periods of operation. So notably the periods when it was perceived that the most people were murdered. So in Treblinka, as I mentioned, the extermination camp period is very well known. And at Bergen Belsen, there's a tendency to focus on the final few months even of the camp's operations. But both camps actually had a much broader temporal and spatial impact than historical narratives suggest. And both comprised of a number of camps. They comprised of execution sites and burial places, and a number of buildings, many of which existed long before the extermination camp at Treblinka was built, for example, and the concentration camp at Bergen Belsen came into existence. But the result of the historical narratives focusing on those periods is that certain aspects of the victims' stories have not been told, and certain sites have been marginalised physically in the literature and within subsequent notions of heritage. And so with all this in mind, when I began my investigations at both of these sites, at Treblinka in 2007 and Bergen Belsen in 2015, I was often told by historians, members of the public, that there would be no evidence left to find, and that everything that could be learnt about these camps could only be found in historical sources. However, as a forensic archaeologist, I very much challenged this view. And I always refer back to a fundamental concept in forensic science, which is that of Locard's principle, which is that every contact leaves a trace. And so as a forensic archaeologist, I was very conscious that crimes of the scale and magnitude of the Holocaust couldn't simply be erased from the landscape, that traces of these places and more importantly, traces of the victims who suffered there and were killed there must be there and must be left to find. And therefore, building on the developments in forensic archaeology, particularly since the 1980s, I decided to investigate how much archaeological work had been undertaken at these places and to develop new surveys. So there's a crucial other issue to consider here, however. Obviously, my first task was to convince the authorities in both of these locations, to convince historians and others about the value of undertaking archaeological work and what this new area of Holocaust studies at that time could tell us over and above historical sources. But I faced another more pertinent challenge in relation to both of these sites, and indeed at the majority of sites where the victims who were killed were Jewish. And that is that Jewish law stipulates that human remains buried in a grave must not be disturbed, owing to the belief that the body is tied to the soul, and thus to disturb the body and the soil in which it resides is to disturb the soul of a person. And therefore I had to develop a methodology that enabled me to locate, document, and potentially recover evidence at Treblinka and Bergen Belsen in a way that prevented the disturbance of graves and respected Jewish law, but which would tell us new information about these important places and the people who suffered there. The result ultimately was a methodology that centered on largely non-invasive methods. And I will speak more about these individual techniques and the benefits they bring as I progress through the presentation. But in summary, my work starts off as a traditional historian's work would, with archival research, with collecting documents, collecting maps, plans, aerial photographs, collecting as many of these as I can over time during the times when the camps were in operation and in the years since to assess the landscape change that may have taken place. I use oral testimonies looking for information about how buildings looked, what people could see from particular vantage points in camps, what they knew about mass murder and the burials that were created. And if possible, I go back and interview witnesses firsthand to ask them those spatial questions that perhaps historians interviewing them may not. I also draw upon satellite imagery and aerial photographs, and where possible, as in the case at Treblinka and Bergen Belsen, I was able to do LiDAR survey, which is a form of airborne laser scanning that enables you to create a digital terrain model of a whole camp landscape, looking for subtle traces on the surface and also depressions in the ground, vegetation change that may be indicative of buried remains. And I'll show you shortly why that was particularly important at both of these sites. Moving into the field, I conduct archaeological walkover survey, looking for physical traces such as building remains, vegetation change that again might indicate the presence of remains, and any surface scatter objects that may be present. And I use a wide range of mapping technologies like GPS systems, total station surveying that enable you to plot the location and draw plans, essentially digital plans of surface remains. And then moving beneath the ground, I use a wide range of geophysical survey techniques, such as ground penetrating radar and resistance survey, which look for different physical properties in the soil and the contrast and disturbances caused by the presence of buried structures and buried graves, for example. So all of these methods have to be combined and utilized together as is appropriate on a site-by-site basis. And all of the data is then layered in geographical information systems to enable me to compare archival materials such as maps and photographs with the data that I collect in the field. And where excavation did take place, as in the case of Treblinka, for example, we did some minimally invasive excavations to try and disturb the ground as little as possible. And largely those excavations took place in areas away from human remains. As I said, the geophysical methods, the non-invasive methods, allowing us to identify the positions of mass graves meant that we could then target our excavations on structures in order to respect Jewish law. And obviously off the back of this, we do a lot of work with visualization and exhibitions that I'll mention later to get this information out to the wider public. So I'll start with the example of Treblinka, as this was the very first Holocaust site that I utilised my non-invasive methodology at. back in, as I say, starting in my research in 2007 and undertaking the first field work there in 2010, and many seasons since. As I mentioned, Treblinka is best known as an extermination camp. The death toll itself has never been exactly pinpointed, but somewhere in the region of 800,000 to 1 million people were killed there. And at its peak, 10 to 12,000 people a day were sent to Treblinka. This site was an extermination camp proper. The only living accommodation that was built there was for the Jews who were kept alive, to assist with sorting the victims' belongings, and then emptying the gas chambers and disposing of the bodies, firstly in mass graves, and then later taking ashes from the cremation pyres that were ultimately constructed at the site when the number of people killed was significantly increased. So this was designed as one of the Operation Reinhard death camps to annihilate the Jewish population of Europe. However, there were also Roma people and also non-Jewish Poles who were sent to the camp as well. What is lesser known, though, is that Trebblinka actually comprised of a landscape which also consisted of a labour camp as well, and an execution site centred around a quarry that existed at the site during and prior to the war. And these sites are really important because actually the existence of the labour camp and the execution site ultimately paved the way for the extermination camp being built in this area. So I want to just give a little bit of a brief introduction to the labour camp, although I won't have time today to say too much about the archaeological works we did there, but I'm happy to answer any questions about that at the end. In the spring of 1941, so-called political prisoners were first brought to a remote yet well-connected area near Treblinka railway station, which you can see on the map here. And they were sent to work in a gravel quarry under the control of the Wehrmacht. And at this time, workers were housed in a small number of buildings at the edge of the quarry. And this camp went through several developments. It was governed by a number of different organisations. It became a workers' educational camp, supposedly to rehabilitate non-Jewish Poles. And then in September 1941, a permanent camp was constructed, which became known as SS and Police Labour Camp Treblinka. And the quarrying operations at this time were expanded, and various construction projects were undertaken on the nearby rivers, roads and railways. And you can see from the map here that the infrastructure around Treblinka meant that it was well connected by road and by rail, but it was also significantly remote enough in that it was in an area of rather inconspicuous forest. And therefore the labour camp gave a sort of degree of anonymity to the crimes that were perpetrated there and then later at the extermination camp. And the labour camp was set up for so-called social vermin and parasites in the first instance, in the words of the Nazi leadership. And it was governed by a camp commandant, Theodor van Eupen, and then Dr. Ludwig Fischer, who was the governor of the district of Warsaw in the general government of Poland. And officially, Treblinka was a penal labour camp where prisoners would be interned for between 2 and 6 months for punishments for a wide range of misdemeanours, mainly relating to a failure to work for or deliver goods to the Third Reich. However, in reality, anyone who was considered an enemy of the Reich could be sent to this camp. And so some of the things that people were interred for, including being Jewish or being related to a Jew, being considered a political enemy, being a soldier in an army within a German-occupied area and failing to obey the new order, or being Roma or Sinti in the case of one of the known transports. And transports to this camp came from Warsaw, but also from other surrounding regions. And some people really did serve a 2 to 6 month sentence and then were subsequently released. However, as time progressed and depending on the individual circumstances, the likelihood of death and execution in the camp became more likely. And this was particularly true for the Jewish population of the camp, who mainly comprised of specialist labourers who, once they'd been seen to were no longer useful, were ultimately executed alongside their non-Jewish counterparts. And ultimately 10,000 people were murdered at the site between when it opened in September 1941 and when it was shut down in July 1944. So it operated simultaneous to and beyond the lifetime of the extermination camp that would follow. And as I said, I'm only going to say something very briefly about the work that we did there, but ultimately, using a range of mapping technologies, we were able to walk the landscape. We were able to map the camp boundaries for the very first time. We were able to map the foundations of the structures that did survive at this site. The Nazis went to much, their extent of destruction at this site wasn't as great as at the nearby extermination camp, because they didn't feel that they needed to hide the evidence here so much, because people genuinely believed this was a labour camp. And so the foundations of many of the barracks survive. The cellar here that you can see of the camp kitchen survives, along with punishment bunkers and a number of features in the SS living area. So we used a method called photogrammetry as well, and also laser scanning, to essentially create 3D models of the surviving structures that exist at the camp, as well as two-dimensional maps of the site. And then we did a very detailed analysis of the life in the camp as it related to the architecture, in terms of looking at the zones in which people were kept, how they were segregated from each other, how features such as the punishment bunker in the center of the camp were used to torture and ultimately kill individuals in this camp, and how from their relatively luxurious part of the camp, the SS looked on as these atrocities were being perpetrated, and how they essentially used this camp as an area of entertainment where they all competed with each other to find the most horrific means of killing these individuals. So we also identified a number of unmarked mass graves at the execution site nearby the labour camp as well, which subsequently went on to be marked. And all in all, this work painted a terrible, atrocious picture of the horrors that were perpetrated at this camp. And really, the title of labour camp doesn't do justice to the level of atrocities that were really perpetrated here. And so after reviewing all of this evidence, it was very clear that the decision to construct the extermination camp at Treblinka in the spring of 1942 was really based on the successful confinement of inmates in the labour camp and their subsequent murder, and the execution, I should say, as well, of people who were sent directly from prisons in Warsaw to be executed at the execution site as well. This all went undetected by the local national and international community for around about a year. And this association of the name Treblinka with forced labour also allowed the Nazis to successfully transport prisoners to the extermination camp when it was first opened for many months before rumours began to spread about the extermination camp's true purpose, which, as I said, was the total annihilation of the Jewish population. So, as I've already mentioned, we have quite a complex landscape at the extermination camp that was formed. We have a perception that the Nazis successfully destroyed all of the traces of not only the mass graves by exhuming them and cremating the bodies in the later periods of the camp's operations, but also the buildings, as I said, when the camp was subsequently demolished. And after the war, investigators of the Polish Main Commission for the Investigation of German Crimes in Poland spent only 5 days in the terrain of the extermination and labour camp. And they concluded that their conclusions were what made it into the historical narratives that I mentioned before, because they stated that all of the evidence of the gas chambers, for example, and the mass graves had been destroyed. And however, the documentary record around the site is conflicting with that narrative. So part of my work has been to go back and look at historical sources, and it was very evident from their investigations that actually a lot of evidence did survive at the site. And with the benefit of modern forensic knowledge and a greater recognition really of the importance of material objects, it became very clear to me that actually they overlooked an awful lot of evidence that did survive at the site and which subsequently became buried. And therefore, I realized when I started my forensic archaeological investigation that hopefully that evidence would still be there to find. So I spent a lot of time analysing maps and drawings made by witnesses and accompanying testimonies, and as I said, the forensic reports of these, not only the Polish but also the Soviet investigators who searched the site in the 1940s. And you can see here an image of Treblinka from 1944, which shows the landscape literally scattered with objects, personal belongings of victims, belongings of the guards who were held in the camp, barbed wire, fences, traces of buildings, bricks, for example. And one of the reports is kind of sums up, it's very telling of the attitude really of the post-war investigators, where they said at present time no traces of the camp are left except for the cellar passage with protruding remains of burnt posts, the foundations of the administration buildings and an old well. Here and there can also be traced the remaining of burnt fence posts, pieces of barbed wire, short sections of road. There are other traces, for example, in the eastern part over a surface covering about 5 acres. And the report goes on to document actually that they did find an abundance of evidence. But they concluded, as I said, that because they hadn't found the gas chambers, they hadn't found the mass graves, that no evidence was left there to find. And therefore, this is what's gone down in history as this kind of the narrative of Treblinka, that the site was sterilised. And so, using new methods with a greater appreciation of these different evidence types, being able to use non-invasive methods to map the site, we were able to do a number of things at Treblinka in those early years of 2010, for example, and 2013 during our survey. And I want to focus really on the discovery of the gas chambers and some of the objects. So I'm going to summarise here some of the other findings. So firstly, we were able to identify the camp boundaries at Treblinka, which was very important because obviously that meant that we were able then to build up a detailed picture of where other features like the gas chambers and the lazaret, which was the fake hospital behind which people were burnt in mass graves, were located. We were able to locate the reception camp area where people were brought into the camp and the living camp, and therefore understand something about the spatiality of the site. And our research showed that the current memorial markers at Treblinka actually don't mark the exact area of the camp. They illustrate it as much smaller area than it actually is. And a whole swathe of land is missing from the memorial area to the north. So that was the first piece of information we were able to deliver to the memorial at Treblinka. We then subsequently located a number of reception camp structures and traces in that area, including one of the sorting barracks where the victims' belongings were sorted when they arrived on the railway platform. We illustrated the railway platform itself was much bigger than the current memorial suggests. And we were able to find that the lazaret, that fake field hospital that I mentioned, and the probable location of a mass grave behind it, where many victims sadly perished, and many elderly people and children, for example, were taken and either pushed straight into the burning pit or were shot and killed at this site instead of them making the walk to the gas chambers. So that was a very important part of Treblinka's history and says something about the brutality, the face-to-face mass murder that was going on in this camp. As I said, as we'd done that, we were also very conscious that we needed to identify the areas where mass graves may be located, because those areas were simply part of the field landscape of Treblinka where visitors could walk over and they could see the memorial with 17,000 stones, but they could walk on the grass. And we knew that these areas were likely areas where mass graves had been located, probably were still located, because not all of the remains were exhumed and cremated, as historical narratives tend to suggest, and where cremated bodies were buried subsequently in pits as well. So the geophysical survey work, in particular the ground penetrating radar, enabled us to identify a number of areas that we believe contained probable graves. And then, having done this, we also, as part of that geophysical survey, particularly again with the ground penetrating radar, we were able to identify what we believe to be structural remains under the ground. So ground penetrating radar essentially uses radio waves that are emitted into the ground and returned to an antenna. And those radio waves are returned to that antenna differently based on the properties of the soil and the material buried within the soil. So we get a different signature from structural remains than we would, for example, from a backfilled pit. And the ground penetrating radar enables us to identify an area that we could see on the ground. It was a sunken depression that we could see on the ground, but it enabled us to identify the likely presence of structural remains in this area. And in fact, we identified what we believed at that time to be two features, one covering an area of about 44 by 20 metres, and another one, more rectangular feature measuring 22 by 15 metres. And what's important to point out here is that the gas chamber buildings at Treblinka were the only buildings in the death camp area to be constructed of brick. All of the other buildings, the sorting barracks and the barracks that the Jews who were members of the Sonderkommando lived in, were temporary structures. They were built often of wood, and therefore were unlikely to have left the same kind of geophysical signature as a building made of more substantial materials like bricks and with solid foundations. And so at this point, having identified this, particularly this feature, the 22 meters by 15, we were very confident, based on the analysis of historical materials, that this could be the remains of the old gas chambers, which are the first gas chambers to have been built at Treblinka, the smaller of those two structures. And essentially what you can see here on the left-hand side of the screen is an annotated version of the geophysical survey. You can see that building, as I said, roughly rectangular structure. And on the right-hand side, you can see the bare earth model of the LiDAR data. So this is the laser scanning method I mentioned, which essentially allows you to create a digital terrain model to strip away vegetation and look for subtle depressions in the soil. And you can see there a depression indicating the presence of buried remains, which corresponded to this geophysical feature that we found, which we believe to be the structural remains of the old gas chambers. And I should say that in popular histories about Trebblinka now, even still, you will read that the memorial obelisk at Trebblinka was actually constructed over where post-war investigators believed the gas chambers to have been. And so our work, as you'll see shortly, demonstrated that that isn't actually the case. The memorial obelisk does not mark the location of the gas chambers, but actually they were situated much further away from the railway platform and much further into the current camp landscape. And so after identifying this structure, we had various conversations with the Chief Rabbi of Poland about the fact we'd identified probable mass grave locations, and we would like to do some test pit excavations in areas away from those mass graves to try and confirm whether this was in fact the old gas chamber building. So we were permitted to do some small test trenches, usually 2 meters by 1 meter, 1 meter by a meter to begin with. And essentially this revealed the walls, demolition rubble and the foundations of the old gas chamber buildings. And the foundations survived at around 85 centimetres below the surface. And there was a large amount of rubble and sand above them, which demonstrated the lengths that the Nazis did in fact go to hide their crimes. So whilst the foundations were, at least in some areas, surviving intact in situ, we could see from the large amounts of damage to the bricks, the tiles and other materials that we found, that attempts had really been made to destroy the fabric of this building. And another thing we identified was that this area, the foundations, had large areas of sand pushed over the top of them. And there were objects and materials mixed in with that sand in some areas, and in other areas it was very clean sand. And again, archival research matching that with our findings was incredibly important. And we have this the sketch here from Samuel Willenberg that he drew, where he showed sandbanks around the edge of the death camp area at Treblinka. And they were constructed to hide from view from people arriving on the trains what was going on in the death camp area. Obviously that people were being gassed and buried in mass graves. And so what we believe has happened here is that when the camp was demolished, these sandbanks were essentially pushed over the remains of the gas chamber buildings to hide them from view when the camp was leveled. And this appears to be an incredibly effective method, because when the post-war investigators dug some test trenches, they saw what they believed to be clean sand or maybe rubble and debris, and therefore they ceased their excavations. And in fact, they just simply did not dig in the right place and simply did not dig deep enough, because the Nazis, as I say, had used this sand to cover the traces of these structures. And you can see some of the fragments of brick and some of the tiles and some of the other building materials and large pieces of foundation stone that we recovered on the slide here. And following the discovery of the sections of walls and bricks, samples were sent for tests to confirm whether carbon monoxide was present, since it was believed that gas at Treblinka was delivered to the old gas chamber by way of a diesel engine, possibly from a Russian tank. And these tests confirmed that high concentrations of carbon monoxide were present in the samples, and that these were likely to be as a result of exposure to carbon monoxide rather than from natural absorption from the air. So this again added to the impression that this was likely part of the old gas chamber structure. In 2007, we excavated in another area, the eastern end of the feature identified in the geophysical survey, and subsequently, as I said, identified as the old gas chamber in 2013. And documentary evidence suggested that the eastern end of the old gas chambers was where the room that housed the tank engine to supply the carbon monoxide to the gas chambers had been located. And the image you can see here on the left is the only known photograph of the gas chambers and the structure which housed, as I said, the tank engine. And so having located the foundations and the construction debris from the building, and we already knew, therefore, the shape and plan of that structure, the architecture and the aesthetic of the building from the building materials that were uncovered. The purpose of the 2017 excavation really was to try and advance knowledge on how the gas chamber operated and the level of destruction inflicted upon the building by the Nazis in an attempt to hide their crimes. And what this essentially showed us was that at this eastern end, a slope was discovered which appeared to form a bank or a large edge of a pit. And that's what you can see in the image in the bottom right of the screen here, is this sloped area underneath the red and white scale that you can see in the photograph. And given the shape and size of this feature and the items found adjacent to it, it seems like this slope is part of a pit edge that was actually excavated by a machine during the demolition of the old gas chambers. And the slope itself actually exceeded the depth, the 0.85 meter depth of the foundations located on the other side of the building in 2013. So this essentially showed us that this excavation was most likely done in order to remove the foundations at this end of the building and to destroy it to a much greater extent. And therefore this large void was created, and then other building materials and items from the area were dumped within it. So we found many personal items, we found more building material in this area, and then the area was leveled and that redeposited sand was placed over the top. So it's fair to say that at the end of the building where the tank engine would have been, the level of destruction of that building was much greater than at the other end of that building. So that's a sort of important part of the sort of attempts, if you like, for the Nazis to hide their crimes. Another attempt for them to hide what they were doing at the time rather than after came to light in the form of tiles that we discovered during the excavations. Now, inmates who were in the camp who saw the gas chambers, of course, were few and far between. Most of the people who were involved in their construction or who worked in them were subsequently killed themselves. But we're very fortunate that we do have some testimonies, particularly of Jankel Wienik, who wrote a book after the war, A Year in Treblinka, and created very detailed maps of the camp. And he talks and describes the gas chambers. And one of the descriptions we have relays how there was a room that was not too large. It looked like a regular shower room with all the accoutrements of a public bathhouse. And the walls of the room were covered with small white tiles. It was very fine, clean work. But the floor was covered with small orange terracotta tiles. And orange terracotta tiles, yellow tiles are mentioned in a number of testimonies by people who were able to see inside the gas chambers. So when we discovered tiles matching that exact description, obviously that added further evidence that the building we'd found there was the first gas chamber building at Treblinka. And you'll note here that there is an emblem on the bottom, on the underside of the tiles, a D and an L, which stood for Jawohlski and Lange, which was a famous Polish tile manufacturing company, in fact the largest tile manufacturing company in Poland. And the star is actually their logo, their emblem. And so we still don't know, despite extensive research, where exactly these tiles came from. We know they were manufactured by Jawohlski and Lange, but we don't know whether they were manufactured specifically for use in these buildings, or whether they were taken from an existing structure elsewhere within the Warsaw Ghetto. But what we do know is that these exact tiles have been observed in a mikveh in Lublin, for example, a synagogue in Vyszów, in the ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto, and in other mikvehs as well, elsewhere in Poland. So the suggestion here is that these tiles could have been specifically selected, not only to make the building, the old gas chambers, look like a bathhouse, but specifically to make them look like a Jewish ritual bath, to look like a mikveh, to give people the illusion that they were going to a bathhouse, and undoubtedly, as another level of insult to the people that were ultimately murdered in this space. And so research into the origin of the tiles is certainly continuing, as well as research into the construction of the extermination camp and the other objects that we found as well. And here's an image of the mikveh I mentioned in Lublin after it had been reconstructed recently, and a very similar tile to the one we found that we discovered there. We also found 998 individual objects, and as I said, I can't reiterate enough that these were very minimally invasive excavations. We're talking about small trenches, very small trenches, yet we were able to recover a large number of objects in addition to the large numbers of bricks and building materials that we found. And so 998 objects were uncovered in 2013 excavations alone, and more than 400 during the 2017 works in the area surrounding the old gas chamber buildings. And a small number of personal belongings were found amongst this assemblage, the majority of which, I should say, belonged to women. And witness testimonies state that women shaved their heads before entering the gas chambers, and their belongings were taken from them in the reception camp area. So therefore, the discovery of personal items like this in the area of the old gas chambers was somewhat unexpected. But it seems likely that some of the objects, like the rose brooch or the small gold pendant that you see here, may have been smuggled into the camp area by their owners. And likewise, on occasion, when the camp was operating to capacity, we know from testimonies that women had their heads shaved in the gas chamber area itself rather than in the reception camp area. So that may explain the presence of scissors and also of the large number of hair clips that we found were discovered. And others, of course, may have found their way into that area of the camp when it was levelled at the end of 1943. And I should say as well, in the course of the excavations in the death camp, we did find a considerable amount of human remains that were scattered, not buried in a grave, but mixed with the debris of the gas chamber buildings. And as per the advice of the chief rabbi of Poland, these remains were recovered and reburied by a representative of his office. And although we weren't able to carry out scientific analysis in order to respect Halakha, I should say that many of the remains found weren't cremated. Many of them were fragmented, many of them were disarticulated. Some of them had been subjected to burning of varying degrees, but were still identifiable, suggesting that not all of the bodies were cremated, as historical sources often do suggest. And we did find a large number of gold and silver teeth and dentures in this area, again, affirming witness testimonies that discuss those items being taken from the bodies after the gassings had taken place. And as I said, all of those bodily parts and human remains were reburied on the site as per the guidance of the chief rabbi of Poland. We also came across another area of structural remains. As I mentioned, the GPR survey showed another feature over an area of about 44 meters by 20. The results from 2013 were a little inconclusive, and so we redid the GPR survey in this area in 2017, and we identified two distinct features. The first was rectangular in shape, and then there were a number of other areas that likely represented structural debris. And so we carried out some small-scale excavations in 2017 to try and identify what this rectangular feature that we identified may have been. And at approximately 1 meter beneath the surface, so just again below the level that we found the foundations in the other area, we found two roughly circular features in the ground. And our conclusion with this was that these likely represent the remains of post or stake holes. And we believe most likely that these may have been pile foundations. So when buildings are built, for example, in sand or loose subsoil, often they need these kinds of these footings, these load spread footings, to be constructed in order to hold them in place. So we believe that in this area, the foundations of the buildings were removed to a much greater extent than in the area of the old gas chambers, leaving behind only in this area, at least, the subtle traces of these post holes. And this seems to be confirmed by witness testimonies, which suggest that the lengths gone to destroy the new gas chambers, the much larger building, were far greater And in these areas, we found very little in the way of structural remains, very little in the way of bricks. So the area does seem to have been sterilised to a much greater extent than in the smaller area of the earlier gas chambers. And the majority of objects we found during the 2017 exercise, aside from the ones I already mentioned in the area of the old gas chambers, were actually found in the area of the camp's waste pit at Treblinka. And some of these objects were found on the surface in 2013 and 2017. They included things like cups, mugs, pans, items that potentially would have been used by the SS guards and the Treblinka men in the camp, but could have also been used by the small number of Jewish prisoners who were kept to help with the camp operations. The only item we found with any Nazi insignia was a metal sign that you can see here on the slide, which says Lager Polizei on it, which means camp police. That item, as I said, was the only one. It had a swastika in the centre of it. But with the end of the excavations in 2017 in the waste pit itself, and we could see that comprised of various layers of activity, the highest layer likely relating to the period when the camp was demolished and items were thrown in as the camp was being closed down, and then earlier layers where rubbish from the camp was deposited. And we had 201 identifiable objects. We had many, many more that weren't identifiable, but they can be divided into three main groups. The personal belongings of victims, which included items such as suitcases. You can see here one of the suitcase handles at the bottom of the slide. Dress accessories such as buttons, buckles, shoes, hygienic and toilet sets like toothbrushes, combs, razors, perfume bottles, eyeglasses, medical bottles, pen knives, fragments of jewellery, coins, and even pieces of musical instrument, a piece of a cornet or a clarinet, for example. There were bunches of keys that we found, there were cutlery, and there were metal dishes. There were also toys present, and a toy car steering wheel, for example, and the handle of what was likely a child's suitcase. We found a baby's shoe in the area as well. And then also several items connected to the guards, spent ammunition. We also found equipment such as battery fragments, a whistle, a badge, and a high number of alcohol bottles, consistent with many witness testimonies that talk about alcoholism being prevalent amongst the camp guards. And then we had items related to the camp fencing, building materials, barbed wire, for example, as well. So these items give us an insight into the victims of Treblinka, the guards, and of course, the actual infrastructure of the camp itself. And ultimately, these works have resulted in many things. I'm working on a book now about Treblinka, which I hope will be out sort of in the next 18 months, but we've published many papers on this if you do wish to know more. We also created a permanent exhibition at Treblinka, which has been open at the site now since 2015, which shows some of the objects found in the camp, including the tiles, the rubble, and the personal belongings. It also shows the evidence that we found at the labour camp, and we also did an outdoor exhibition there as well, where we marked every single structure in the labour camp and provided new information about life in those buildings. And we have a travelling version of that exhibition, which has been shown in the Wiener Library in London and also in Windermere in the United Kingdom as well. And we continue to obviously exhibit that wherever we can and to speak to people about the archaeological work that we've done at Treblinka to ensure that more information about this is known. And we've also created digital reconstructions of the objects that we found, and many of those can be found online, available through Sketchfab, and we'll continue to build that archive, that digital repository of the objects from the site. And as I said, happy to take any more questions about any of the findings at Treblinka. So I'll now move on in the final segment of the presentation to talk about Bergen Belsen. The work there was undertaken over a much shorter period, and the results can be confined really to a few main areas. But just to say something at first about the history of this camp. So since it was liberated by the British military on the 15th of April 1945, Bergen Belsen, located in Germany, has been perceived by many as the archetypal example of a concentration camp. And it's become absolutely synonymous with the cruelty of the Nazi regime. Now, in part, that's been because There have been shocking images and film footages of bodies piled high and being bulldozed into mass graves, which were embedded into British consciousness in particular, because these were shown in cinema reels, in cinemas. They were shown in the press. And people really had this image of Bergen-Belsen, of the bodies that the liberators found that scattered the camp landscape. And essentially the evidence, the photographs, the video footage revealed that tens of thousands of people at the camp had died as a result of starvation, ill treatment and disease during the concentration camp period alone. And recent scholarship shown, however, in reality, that Bergen-Belsen was in fact far from a typical concentration camp, if indeed there is such a thing in Holocaust history. And the iconography really portrays only the events of the final months of its existence. And as I said, at different times, Bergen-Belsen's become as this crude metaphor, as Tony Kushner has described, for the universal horrors of the war, man's capacity for evil, Jewish suffering and Nazi German atrocities. And it's become very much a contested site where victim groups and certain narratives have been emphasized or downplayed at the expense of others. And so because of Bergen-Belsen's place in British imagination and international consciousness, there's been very little discussion concerning the extent and nature of mass graves at the site, the various methods of body disposal that were used by the Nazis and by the British liberators, and what might have happened to the thousands of individuals whose bodies have never been found. Because the liberators went to this camp, they documented it, the historical narrative suggests that we know everything there is to know because the evidence was there for the world to see. And the well-tended memorial, as I say, that was created after only furthered this belief. But as I said, the British burnt down the camp. They didn't document it. They were very much concerned with the control of disease. So they knocked down the crematorium, they knocked down the barracks, they burnt them. They buried the bodies in mass graves as quickly as is physically possible. And they didn't search for the traces of mass graves that already existed there. They only noted the ones that were still open, where depressions perhaps were visible in the ground, and of course the ones where they themselves buried the bodies of the victims who died in those final days, or who died sadly after liberation as well. So the camp landscape itself is dotted with 13 mass grave mounds, which are marked with the numbers of dead who were contained therein. And that's been taken as the kind of the sign that the mass graves had all been found, and that all the details of the atrocities, as I said, were well known. However, the history of Bergen-Belsen is much more complex than that. And so the first camp to be established at Bergen-Belsen was in fact a military camp constructed in 1935 by the German army. And then that was expanded up to and beyond the start of World War II to include several military bases and prisoner of war camps. And in June of 1941, Stalag 311 was created south of the main military base known as Hona to house 20,000 Soviet POWs. And these Soviet POWs were subject to starvation, ill treatment and disease. And this resulted in 19,500 deaths by January 1945 of Soviet POWs alone. And their story is hardly ever told in the context of Bergen-Belsen's history. From the spring of 1943, the southern section of the camp was taken over by the SS and Business Administration Office, and a detention camp Bergen-Belsen was created. Essentially, the camp was unusual because it housed Jews to be exchanged for Germans captured by the Allies, but actually, in reality, only around 200 people were actually exchanged. And so then Roma people, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, criminals, asocials, political prisoners were housed in the camp. And whilst the conditions were better than occurred later, it was still very much a place of disorder, dominated by roll calls, barbed wire and work. In March 1944, Bergen-Belsen was designated a recovery camp, and so sick and dying prisoners from other camps were transported here, as were women en route to the German satellite camps. But after December 1944, when an increased number of transports arrived from the evacuated camps such as Auschwitz, did the completely overcrowded, disease-infested and corpse-ridden Bergen-Belsen that was documented by the liberators came into existence. And the increased prisoner number was dramatic. At this point, it rose from 15,000 people in December 1944 to 22,000 in February 1945, 41,250 in March. And by the time the liberators arrived, there were 55,000 people imprisoned in Bergen-Belsen in a space that was intended to hold only 10,000 prisoners. And obviously the number of deaths at that time went up. And the picture of this camp is a truly appalling one. Prisoners were left to fend for themselves. They no longer worked at this period. Food, water, room to sleep were all withdrawn. Cannibalism was rife. Typhus and typhoid were commonplace. And so even though Bergen-Belsen wasn't a death camp proper like Treblinka, essentially there was no doubt that really people were there going to die. They were not necessarily directly murdered, but they were allowed to simply perish in these humane conditions. And so in 2015, the United Holocaust Memorial Foundation commissioned a survey which will be undertaken by myself and my team, and by ScanLab Projects, a laser scanning company located in the United Kingdom. And this was the first at the site to combine LiDAR technology, laser scanning technology, drone survey with ground penetrating radar, excuse me. It should be said that at this time we targeted 3 main areas. The first area being an area around the part of the camp where the prisoners were held during the concentration camp period, the second being the area of the crematorium, and the third being an area of purported additional mass graves. I'm just going to play you a few videos now, and there's no sound, I'll talk over the top of them, but you'll be able to see some of the images of the work that was carried out. So the survey, as I said, mentioned used laser scanning, it used ground penetrating radar, it used drone survey, and ultimately this enabled us to create a very detailed 3-dimensional model of the terrain of the site and features invisible essentially to the naked eye. You can see here the first full aerial scan of the site itself that was created of the modern camp terrain. And again, like with Trebblinka, by comparing 1940s aerial photography, specific areas of interest were targeted for specific investigations. Close to the crematorium, oh sorry, I'm just going to go back a slide there. Sorry about that. Close to the area of the crematorium where we targeted our investigation in the first instance, a number of really important features were identified. So the first you can see here, you can see the aerial photograph geo-referenced over the top of the data. And this is the area that we carried out the radar scan. And we were able to identify the remains of a very primitive sewage system that was connected from the barrack area where the majority of prisoners were living in the concentration camp period to the exterior of the camp. And the blue line there indicates a drainage trench. And obviously we know that the camp was rife with typhoid, and it's not surprising when you consider the fact that this drainage system was completely inadequate. We also targeted our work around the area of the crematorium, and we know from historical sources that this was a metal oven housed within a wooden structure, and it was used throughout from 1944 until the end of the camp's period of operation. And what you can see here on the slide is the geophysical signature of the crematorium. And this revealed a square structure within another circular structure. And this demonstrated that the traces of the crematorium building, approximately 6.15 by 6.15 meters, did indeed still survive. That part of the structure was likely under one of the memorials marking the area of a purported mass grave. And that part of the structure existed in the landscaped area of the memorial. And so this demonstrated that even though the British removed the oven, they demolished the building, they didn't actually remove all traces of the foundations of this particular structure. And so that was a really important discovery for the Memorial Museum, and of course spoke to the fact that the British, in terms of landscaping of the site, and when the memorial was built, they obviously put a memorial to a mass grave over the remains of the crematorium. So that called into question the accuracy of these memorial markers of the mass graves that were present. one of the crucial discoveries that we made then, therefore close to the crematorium, was that we identified several areas where we believe there to be unmarked mass graves. One of the areas you can see here on the slide was a compacted area of buried material which extended to a depth of at least 4.5 meters. And again, with comparisons of aerial images, then we could see that this area was a disturbed area of ground in the concentration camp period. And we know from historical sources that, as I said, that corpses lay on the ground after liberation, that the British used existing mass graves that were open to bury those bodies, that they dug their own graves, that they buried them very swiftly during this period, that they erected these mounds very quickly with these numbers on them, but they didn't erect those in all areas. And they didn't place the markers on those mounds until some time after the burials had taken place. So it's highly likely that they in fact forgot the locations of some of the mass graves that they themselves dug. Likewise, the Nazis created obviously mass graves that were levelled over and were not subsequently marked. And as I said, the British didn't search for those mass graves because their priority was to care for the living. So therefore, it's highly likely from historical sources that additional mass graves did exist in the terrain of Bergen Belsen. And the GPR survey that I showed you there showed two parallel features, a large feature measuring 63 meters by 58 meters in length and extending to a depth of approximately 5 meters in the depth of the survey. And this particular feature we believe to be the location of what historical sources seem to suggest was a quarry or a gravel pit. And historical sources suggest that the British buried 2,000 bodies in this quarry pit after liberation. We can see in the geophysical survey results that there is a ramp going down into this feature and that there is another pit at the very bottom of backfilled material, suggesting that there could in fact be a grave within the quarry pit itself, which was then subsequently backfilled. We also identified, as I said, two linear features next to each other, which we again believe could be bodies from the concentration camp period that existed in unmarked mass graves. And the GPR results showed two anomalies in this area, 0.5 meter beneath the surface. The first was 30.5 by 8.5 meters and extended to 4.5 meters in depth. The second, 30 meters by 12.5 meters. So these are significant geophysical anomalies, as we call them, significant features that we believe through comparison with the aerial photograph that you can see in the bottom right-hand corner there, were likely mass graves that, as I said, were unmarked. And one particular survivor, Van Lambert, referred to a mass grave to the very east of the crematorium area in which he himself buried a friend shortly before liberation. And if we look at the aerial photos, we can see that these graves, probable graves, resided between the crematorium and that quarry pit that I mentioned earlier. And as I mentioned, obviously, these are all non-invasive methods. They mean that we're not necessarily, we're not able to do follow-up excavations on these areas because of Jewish law. However, it's that careful comparison of the airborne LiDAR data, the geophysical results, and other archival materials that's enabled us to come to the conclusions that we have reached around the existence of these structural remnants, and as I said, of the likelihood of unmarked mass graves. I'm very conscious of time, so therefore I'm gonna wrap up now, and I'm happy to answer any further questions about the work at Belsen. But I just want to say that obviously this work has generated a large number of digital models that can be used for conservation, future memorial planning, to try and avoid areas containing human remains, and also to highlight features that exist in the landscape that may not be visible to the naked eye. And the combined use of historical and archaeological investigations at both Treblinka and Bergen Belsen have demonstrated new insights into the diverse nature of camp landscapes. They prove the evidence that these camps do still survive, despite the extensive efforts of the Nazis to hide the evidence of their crimes and destroy the traces of all of the people who were killed there. The mapping of structures, of graves, of boundaries, of forests, of liminal spaces and execution sites all offers new opportunities to understand the nature of confinement and oppression and resistance within the camp landscapes, as do the objects that we've uncovered either on the surface or during the minimally invasive excavations that we've carried out. Some of our work has corroborated historical sources, has demonstrated that what witnesses have said to be true. Other elements of our work have challenged historical narratives. They've given new insights that historical sources simply cannot, by bringing new historical evidence to the fore, in terms of locating graves, for example, and the remains of structures. And they've also demonstrated, as I said, a chance to examine the liminal spaces, the places between the camps, between the burial sites, and all of these unknown parts of the camps, which were undocumented, and the different levels, the different periods of the camp's operations. And I know today I've very much talked about the key areas, the extermination camp, the concentration camp periods at Belsen, but our work has very much demonstrated the archaeological traces left behind at those camps from those earlier periods that I mentioned as well, allowing us to rewrite the history of those sites from those earlier parts of the Second World War. And as I mentioned, it's created new opportunities to create new forms of dissemination, drawing upon interdisciplinary approaches. And we've been very fortunate to work with artists, with filmmakers, and with educational specialists at many levels of education to try and share the evidence that we found, because we found that the material traces, the physical evidence, often encourages people to learn about the Holocaust in a new and exciting and interesting way, and to inspire them to want to know more about the stories of the people who were sent to Treblinka and to Bergen Belsen. And ultimately, while my role as an archaeologist is to focus on material traces, to focus on physical evidence of these crimes, my role is very much, though, to tell the stories of the people. All of this work is a way of telling the stories of those people who suffered and can't speak for themselves. So I hope today that I've shown you some of the evidence that we found, and as part of that commitment to trying to do that. And I hope, obviously, that we are able to continue to do that work and share that with you in the future. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sturdig-Coles. This was an excellent presentation. It's wonderful to hear you speak again, and especially to hear some of this new info on Belsen. I wonder if you could just take a moment to say a little bit about what your work showed about the earlier period of Belsen, when it was primarily a place for Russians and POWs.
Yeah, so we focus more historically on mapping the history of that area, really, and sort of looking at the map progressions to look at how the camp built up. So more about how, again, the presence of those earlier camps was what allowed the concentration camp environment to take place. So we look at some of the earlier buildings being incorporated into the camp landscape, the expansion of the facility, and obviously then the construction of these new features. And so we didn't actually concentrate our geophysical surveys particularly in that area. But we also did start to look at the unmarked burials in those locations, and identified again that there are unmarked burials undoubtedly of the Soviet POWs who were sent to Belsen. And other archaeologists, I should say as well, had already worked at Belsen before us and continued to do so afterwards. And they have subsequently gone on to show as well that there were other areas that likely contained unmarked graves in those earlier areas. So we did predominantly, for that particular survey, focus historically, as I said, on the earlier periods rather than archaeologically, but there's obviously more work to do there in the future.
And how does a place, be it Trebblinka or Belsen, when you have these new findings, how do the memorials then start to incorporate this new work into their official narratives of the locations?
Yeah, that is a difficult process, because obviously there are practical challenges to that. For example, at Treblinka, the boundary is marked by huge granite boulders that are exceptionally difficult to move. And so the museum there, had to find a new approach to be able to mark the new boundary that we found. And they've been very willing to do that, to mark the sites archaeologically that we've uncovered. And so the memorial at Treblinka, the director there, Edward Kapufka in particular, has been very receptive to that. And so, as I mentioned, that we created a permanent exhibition in the memorial space, which exhibited the objects that we found and the maps and the plans that we found. And we created those memorial boards that were placed in the camp landscape so that visitors have a better sense of the labor camp, of what happened there. And they've really embraced that, the archaeological discoveries as a new means to engage visitors and to get a better sense of place. And at Bergen-Belsen, obviously, we've been working very closely, I should say, with our colleagues who work in Barcelona, who from the SPECS lab, who basically had already, before we started to do this work, create a 3D model of Bergen-Belsen and a virtual reconstruction of the site. And then in fact initiated some archaeological work themselves. So we've been working with them in particular and with the Bergen-Belsen Memorial to discuss how these new findings then become part of not only the physical offering on the site, but also in a digital form as well. So I think digital tools are offering new ways to obviously add to the narratives and share these new discoveries really with a much broader audience as well.
I can imagine, especially in Belsen, when the average visitor goes there today, there's so little physical markings left of the bounds of the camp. So it's quite difficult to understand when you're in that space where you are, and just sort of to try and picture it as it had been in the past. So it sounds like this work will really enhance that experience. Is there anything you mentioned when we were talking about the Trebblinka labor camp and findings that you had there? Is there anything you'd like to add now to talk about some of those highlights?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a whole presentation in itself. In fact, I mean, the part of the reason I haven't finished the book yet is because the discoveries at the labor camp, I mean, they're just absolutely shocking and terrible, and really demonstrate how Trebblinka came to be the Trebblinka that most people know. And the sad reality of the labor camp, I know we mapped, for example, I mentioned before, a punishment bunker where people were made to stand, and you can see these tiny cells where people were made to stand before they were ultimately taken to the forest and executed. And we were able to identify in 2013 3 unmarked mass graves at the execution site south of the labor camp. And we worked very closely with the rabbinical authorities to decide what to do, because this was a forested area. So some of the methods I mentioned before didn't work. We couldn't do ground penetrating radar very easily. We could do LiDAR, and that showed pits which were unmarked. And therefore we were allowed to do minimally invasive excavations, just removing the surface detritus. And we could see there that human remains were present. We covered the graves over again under close supervision. So we were able then to have those graves marked. And then in subsequent field seasons, we did use geophysical survey in other areas and LiDAR, and we've now gone on to identify many more unmarked mass graves there of victims of the labor camp, but also, as I mentioned, people who were brought from the prisons in Warsaw in particular, straight, never went to Trebblinka extermination camp, never went to the labor camp, was sent there to be executed. And one of the horrible facts about the labor camp is that these face-to-face executions, these killings for sport, carry on in the labor camp long after the gas chambers exist. When the guards had the option to send people who could no longer work to be killed in the gas chambers, they chose not to. And so some of the testimonies from the labor camp are absolutely sickening and awful, and the stories about these grave sites are terrible. And those graves were unmarked for decades because people overlooked them because of the labor camps, seemingly kind of more inane nature compared to the extermination camp. So we've really tried to tell that story through the architecture and mapping it and understanding the buildings. And we found lots of building foundations as well that the memorial wasn't aware of, which enabled them to then reconfigure all of the memorial boards to say, actually, the building that they had thought was something actually turned out to be something else, because we'd identified the foundations of one building in particular that had kind of had knocked out of sequence all of the memorial board reporting. So that's why we did that new exhibition as well. So yeah, lots more to say on that than I've got time for, I'm afraid.
Well, hopefully we'll be able to, when the book is out, we'll be able to have you back for another presentation just on that, because I know we'd probably all like to hear more about that. Sure. And maybe lastly, you could speak, just maybe 2 final things. One is, where do you see your research going next? And the other one is, I can imagine with work like this in so many different locations, and especially being so culturally sensitive, there's probably a fair number of challenges to the work that you do. So if you could say maybe, what are your challenges, and then where you see yourself going next?
Sure. Yeah, essentially at the moment right now, I'm trying to write up all of the material from the field campaign. Obviously, as I said, I started this work in 2007. So I'm trying to kind of formulate that into a new history of Treblinka. And that work's involved, at the moment I'm still going through all the materials, but new discoveries in Russian archives, for example, in Ukrainian archives in particular, about the post-war investigations. So I've done a kind of retrospective forensic analysis on their reports and their photographs. And so I spent a lot of time working through their discoveries and how far they went with their excavations and what they found, and then their autopsy reports on the bodies that were found, for example, at the execution site. So I'm really kind of trying to tell that story from the origins of Trebblinka, when it was a quarry, a labor camp, through to becoming this execution site for prisoners, through to obviously the extermination camp that we really know today. So that's a large part of the work that I've done has been that, and obviously researching the origins of the objects that we found at the camp. I think moving forward, there's still so many questions. We still want to know more about the new gas chamber building and the extent to which that was destroyed. I would still like to obviously continue the work at the execution site south of the labor camp. I was back there in 2019 with the Institute of National Remembrance in Poland, observing some of their work there as well. So we've been documenting more mass graves in the forest. And yeah, you're absolutely right. This work is incredibly challenging, and obviously making sure the methodology corresponds to Jewish law and respects that has been a huge part of our work. And that was the big challenge at the beginning: how to map a landscape where you can't see any physical traces when you can't dig. So that's been exceptionally difficult. And then at the labor camp, I should say, there's various tensions that exist, because that camp was for Jews, but it was also for non-Jews as well. And so there have been people who want to excavate. For example, the Institute of National Remembrance are very keen to excavate to find the remains of Polish non-Jews, to find the remains of Roma people who were killed. And various communities have different views on whether those excavations should take place or not. So there's often a conflict that emerges there between what is the best approach in the future. So that's been obviously quite a big part of the work that I do, is also exploring those ethical issues around how to deal with that situation when you have multiple people with different views about how the site should be treated in the future. And a lot of my work more generally is on that subject as well.
Thank you so much for that. This has been an excellent presentation. It's always wonderful to learn from you. And like I said, it would be a real pleasure to have you back again in the future. So we'll look forward to the new book.
Thank you. I think there might be some questions in that. I don't know whether we have time for them, but I think there might be some questions in the chat box as well. I don't know if we've seen.
Oh, I think I pulled most of those out. So yep. So I think we're good there.
Thank you.
Yeah. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon for this presentation. And just a quick reminder, our next presentation in the Auschwitz Speaker Series will be on December 1st at 6:30 p.m. down at Union Station. It's Our Mothers Were in Auschwitz, Three Daughters Remember. This is a presentation by three of our speakers in the Second Generation Speakers Bureau. So join us for that. And then on December 8th at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom, we'll be joined by Timothy Snyder and Nora Krug for a presentation on their graphic novel On Tyranny. So look for those upcoming presentations, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.